Okay, so we're going to finish up. We're going to talk about the pectoral girdle and limb of Felis, and then we'll talk about the pelvic girdle and limb of Felis. And as I mentioned before, I have girdle crossed out for pectoral girdle because it's technically not a girdle. It's not connected to both sides. So I have here two scapula for both sides of the cat. And when you're looking at these, you notice that they flare almost like this side's more of a straight edge, whereas this is more rounded. Okay? This is always facing posterior. So if I were to bring in my cat here, you can see how that straight edge point is facing posteriorly. That gives you a little bit of guidance on which way this scapula is facing. If this is facing posteriorly, then you know that this must be on the left-hand side of the cat, because this structure here, which comes off at a perpendicular angle, is the spine of the scapula. And the scapular spine is always facing laterally. Deep on the other side, on the medial side, it's nice and flat. This is going to be a fossa. And you're going to have three main fossas, or four technically, but three where you have muscle attachment on the scapula. This is the subscapular fossa. And I remember that because when I look at the actual way that this is on the animal, let's bring our cat back here. To get to the subscapular fossa, you have to dive deep behind the scapula, in between the scapula and the rib cage. So you're diving deep, and when I think of diving deep, I think of like a submarine, and hence the name subscapular fossa. It's the fossa on the scapula that you need a submarine to get to. That's silly, but you'll remember it. Okay. So if this is my rib cage here, then the subscapular fossa is here. The spine is always facing laterally. If I then look at this from an anatomical perspective, this is on top of the spine, and this is on the bottom of the spine. These are going to be the next two fossas where you see muscle attachment at. This, since we're above the spine, we're going to call supraspinous fossa. Spinous in relation to the spine, supra on top of. Supraspinous fossa. The one below is going to be called infraspinous fossa. Infra meaning below the spine. Infraspinous fossa. So infra and supra are referring to where you are in relation to the spine, hence spinous fossa. Supraspinous, infraspinous. The one on the back is subscapular fossa. It's in relation to the scapula, not the spine. So there's no spinous, it's subscapular fossa. There's one more fossa, but there's no muscle attachment there. This is the one where we articulate with the forelimb. And this is the glenoid fossa. Glenoid. Oh, yeah, glenoid fossa. Whew. And you probably remember we had that in other organisms we looked at as well. At times it was a glenoid fossa. At times it was just a glenoid surface. And if I were to take my humerus, here's my humerus, there's this nice rounded edge on the humerus. That's the head of the humerus. And the head of the humerus is going to articulate right here. Okay? We then have a couple more things I want to show you on the scapula. We have along the spine, as we get closer to the glenoid process, or the glenoid fossa, we are going to have this flare that goes off to the side. And it's hard to see right there, but if I bring this closer, you can see that flare right here that's shooting this way. This is the metachromium process. It's gray on your handout. You don't need to know it. I'm just pointing it out. All right. You have past that, that spine kind of continues past where the scapula ends. This is the chromium process. If I turn this way, here's the spine. You can see the acromion process sticking all the way out. Okay? There's another process that you had that was gray that you don't need to know. You do need to know the acromion process here. My finger's on. And you can remember that that's the very end of the spine if you're going towards the glenoid fossa. On the other side, if we go to the medial side of the scapula, here's my glenoid fossa. There's a process that comes out to the side here. Right here, there's like a little bump. That's the coracoid process. And you remember you had a coracoid bone and cartilage in other organisms as well. Okay, so you can start to see some of the continuousness from one organism to the next. You don't need to know coracoid process, and you don't need to know metachromium process. We'll jump back to the humerus in just a little bit, but one of the things I wanted to show you with the cat, again, is that if I were to spin this cat around so it's facing you, you can see these little bones right here in the front. That's the clavicle. That's the clavicle in the cat. It's extremely small. But you all can probably point to your clavicle, your collarbone. That would be the same bone right there. So let's jump back into the humerus now. So we had, I'm going to move that off to the side. We had the head of the humerus articulating with the glenoid fossa. Okay, so this would be the head of the humerus. And if I were to go to the other side of the head, here, there's another bump, a big ridge, and that's going to be the greater trochanter. You don't need to know that. I'm just pointing it out to you. But between the greater trochanter, that ridge, and the head, you have this divot here, and that's the bicipital groove. So here's the greater trochanter, here's the head, here's the bicipital groove. And you have the head of the biceps running through there as it connects up to the scapula. Okay? If we were to go down to the other side, the distal side of my humerus, I am going to have two more structures that we should know. This one that's more rounded is the capitulum. And the other one has more of a ridge to it. See, the one by my thumb has more of a ridge, almost a disc-like shape to it. That's the trochlea. Okay. So this would be the trochlea, and this would be the capitulum. If we were to spin this around, notice on the other side, there's this really big divot here. That's a fossa. A fossa is a big divot. And that's the olecranon fossa. The olecranon fossa, if we were to take my ulna will fit together and will rotate between the trochlea and the capitulum. And on my ulna, the very end of it is the olecranon. And the olecranon will fit right into the olecranon fossa. The olecranon is your elbow. If you feel your elbow, this is the olecranon of your ulna. If you feel all the way up by where your upper arm is, you can actually feel that it's not the same bone as your humerus. This is your olecranon. It continues off onto your ulna. So those would fit together just like that. Okay. What else do we need to know on the ulna? So we saw the olecranon. This notch here, where we fit the humerus into, if you noticed, we were fitting more of the trochlea into that notch. And so this is called the trochlea notch. The trochlea notch. Okay. There is the coronoid process, which is this ridge, basically, this bump that comes off on the distal side of the trochlear notch. It's the coronoid process. And if you look, the coronoid process has its own little notch. And that's the radial notch. You don't need to know the radial notch. It's in gray, just like the trochlea notch. But this is where the radius will fit in. Hence the name radial notch. All right, what else do we need to know? We need to know styloid process of the radius. Now, of the ulna, sorry. This ulna isn't the best. So if I were to put these two together, you'll notice that these obviously don't go together, these two bones. This one's to a bigger cat, this one's to a smaller cat. And the styloid process has been worn off of this one. But you can even see, even from far away and with the glare, that there is this bump that comes off of the radius. This bump here. That's a styloid process. And if I join these two back together, you'll have a styloid process of the radius, and then on the other side here you have a styloid process of the ulna. So if I took all of these and put them back together, look like that. And then down on this end here, the next thing I would have would be the carpus, and then the metacarpus, and then the phalanges. Very similar to what we saw with all the other organisms we were looking at. All right. We have, lastly, I want to look at the hip, the pelvis. Okay. We already started looking at this before, but we didn't go into depth on this. The pelvis is joined to the sacrum right here. The sacrum would be my hand. And let's just take one of these sides first. If I were to look at this, it's actually 4 bones in one. We're going to really focus on just 3 of them. This one coming up is the ilium. This one here in the posterior side is the ischium. And this one in the anterior side is the pubis. And together, all 3 of those are fused together. There's an acetibulum bone as well, but we're not going to learn that. If we join these 2 together again, and I pretend my hand is the sacrum, you'll notice that the ilium flares off to the sides higher than where the sacrum sits. Those flares are called the iliac crest. If we come back to the ischium on the posterior side here, there's a bump in the back here. You can see it's more prominent if we're looking at it from the underside. And this would be the ischial tuberosity. Okay. This line here represents where the left side is fused with the right side. They're fused together. If we were dissecting our cats, we would have to break through that to get to the inner structures. That is called the symphysis. And so the symphysis of the pelvis, that's the pelvic symphysis. When you're back by the ischium, it's the ischium symphysis. When you're up by the radius, it's referred to as the radial symphysis. And together, the radial symphysis and the ischial symphysis are collectively known as the pelvic symphysis. It's the joining of the 2 sides. The hole that we have here is the obturator foramen. If we turn this over, we see we have a big fossa here. That's the acetibulum. And if we took our femur, it fits right in to that ball and socket joint. This portion of the femur that's going into the acetibulum is the head of the femur. And this is very similar to what we just saw with the humerus. So with the femur, we have the head of the femur, and then right on the other side, we have that other big notch. That's the greater trochanter. And the humerus, we called it the greater tuberosity. On the femur, it's the greater trochanter. And between the 2 here is my trochanteric fossa. You can see there's a big divot here. Trochanteric fossa, greater trochanter, head of the femur. If we then go down to the other side, the distal side of my femur, we have these nice bumps right here, nice and smooth. Those are condyles, and you have the medial condyle and the lateral condyle. Now, since this is the head of the femur, and we know the head of the femur joins into the acetibulum, this must be the middle of the animal, because that's where the pelvis is. Pelvis is here. This is the lateral side of the animal. So that lets me know that this must be the medial condyle, and this must be the lateral condyle. Medial condyle on the same side as the head of the femur, lateral condyle on the opposite side. Between the two is the popliteal notch. And you don't have to know that because that's in gray. If I turn this over to the front side, this bump is a tibial tuberosity. What else do we need to know? I think that, epicondyles. You can't really see the epicondyles very well. They're very worn off on this specimen. But here's how you tell where they're at. The condyles are facing directly back, on the back end of the femur. On the sides, the medial and lateral sides would be the epicondyles. They would be just like little bumps. And if I take this one's a little, this is another femur. Here's my condyles. And here you can kind of see a bump on the side. A bump on the side. Those would be my epicondyles. My medial and lateral epicondyles. Once again, these are going to be a site of muscle attachment. What else do we need? We have our intercondyle fossa. I think that just about does it for the femur. We then move into the tibia. Let me check something real quick before we do that. Yeah, okay. So we'll move into the tibia next. And where did I put my tibia? Here's my tibia. Tibia is a lot bigger than the fibula. Fibula I always think of as a fragile, okay? So fibula, F for fragile. It's a lot smaller. So this is my tibia. And remember here I had my condyles that were nice and smooth on my femur. Those are going to articulate here with these smooth structures on the tibia. And these, just like my fibula, or my femur, these are my lateral and medial condyles. And you'll see articulation just like that. Okay? So these are my lateral and medial condyles. In fact, this would be medial, this would be lateral. Running between those two is the popliteal notch. Popliteal artery will run through that. You'll have a tibial tuberosity. Your tibial tuberosity is on the front end here. And if you remember back to my femur, you had a tuberosity on the front as well. Let me just... I think I called it on the femur the tibial tuberosity. That was incorrect. I apologize. This is my I was getting ahead of myself on the handout there. Tibial tuberosity is on the tibia. That makes sense. I'm not sure. I might have even said popliteal notch. I apologize. Popliteal notch is on the tibia. It's the intercondyloid fossa on the femur. All right, so when these two are together, then in the front here, that would be my patella. There'd be a bone that sits right there. All right, let's go back to my tibia. We had the popliteal notch, tibial tuberosity. Then the last thing I have is what's called a malleolus. And the malleolus is very similar to the styloid process that we saw on the radius and ulna. And so out on the side here, is a little bit of a flare. That's my medial malleolus. And if I took my fibula, see how much smaller it is? This also, if I put it correctly, would have a malleolus. And since this is on the lateral side, that would be the lateral malleolus. Up towards the top here, the proximal side, closer to the body, this is the head of the fibula. And down towards the distal side, on the outside, would be the lateral malleolus. Medial malleolus on my tibia, tibial tuberosity. My femur would articulate like this. And then the side of the pelvis would be right there. And this side could come in like this. And that does it for the pelvic girdle and hind limb. Of course, at the end here, you would have your tarsals next, your metatarsals, and then your phalanges.